Today's episode will include discussions about violence against women. If you or anyone you know needs help, you can reach out to 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced several new measures to combat domestic violence. It comes as it was revealed this week that the rate of women being killed by a partner in Australia increased by nearly 30% in 2022 to 2023 compared to the previous year. Can you first go through what exactly the Prime Minister announced yesterday in relation to this issue?
Yeah, so yesterday the Prime Minister held an emergency national cabinet meeting, and that is just a fancy name for a meeting between the leaders of all the state and territory governments and the Prime Minister. It actually started during the pandemic, but then it has remained since then. And their only focus in that meeting was how they can better combat the issue of violence against women in this country. And at about 11 o'clock yesterday, the Prime Minister came out and held a press conference. And he made several announcements during that press conference. And the main one was that victim survivors escaping partner violence will be eligible for up to $5,000. And that's to help them escape that violent situation that they find themselves in. And it will be split between cash and goods and services, like I said, to help them escape. And so he also announced that he would bring forward laws banning doxing, which is the act of targeting someone by releasing their personal information online.
And that can be anyone.
Exactly. It can be anyone. But in the context of this announcement, it was focused on women and helping women, again, escape those situations. And he also announced that the government will ban the creation and non-consensual distribution of deepfake pornography. And that term deepfake is a term that we are increasingly hearing a lot about in recent years. And it's basically, in this context, fake porn of someone generally created using AI that is not real but looks real.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So a fairly wide range of announcements there, all aimed at creating a safer environment for women and girls in this country. We have heard a fair bit of bipartisanship during this national conversation. And by that term, I just mean that the opposition and the government have agreed that more needs to be done. What did we hear from the opposition after the National Cabinet meeting?
Yeah, so we did hear from the opposition leader, Peter Dutton. He said that he will support the government's measures. So that means that these announcements that the Prime Minister announced will most likely pass Parliament and become law. And a quote from Dutton, he said that women should feel safe in society, but especially they should feel safe in their own homes, which I think is definitely a common sentiment. But just because it got the support of the opposition certainly does not mean that this announcement has widespread support. I think a lot of experts have said that this announcement did not go far enough. Just one example, independent MP Zoe Daniel, she pointed out that there was no additional funding for frontline services made by the Prime Minister, and she also criticised the PM for there being no new funding around housing for women escaping violent homes. And that's in the context of older women being the fastest group of people to become homeless. In this country. One strong quote from Zoe Daniel, I'll just read out, was, "By the time National Cabinet meets again in roughly 90 days, 12,000 women will have been turned away, and at a rate of 1 woman every 4 days, another 22 women may be dead."
It's very clear that everyone agrees that more needs to be done and that we have a real issue on our hands, but it does appear that there seem to be, a few differences of opinion on how we get there and what actually needs to be done. I think one of the most important parts of this discussion is actually being able to identify the problem and knowing with statistics what the issue at hand is. We were able to paint more of an accurate picture with some information that we received on Tuesday. Can you talk me through those new statistics?
Yeah, so on Tuesday, we heard from the Australian Institute of Criminology, and that is a government agency. So this is very official data that we were given. And they revealed that the number of women killed by a partner last year increased by nearly 30% compared to the year prior.
Significant increase.
Yeah, and just a note that when I talk about the data from this report, I'm talking about the financial year for 2022-2023, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to say last year. In terms of what else the report found on this specific issue, it found that of the women who were killed by an intimate partner last year, all were killed by a male partner. It also found that the rate of homicide is far higher for First Nations women. Now, one thing to remember is that this 30% increase is based on last year's figures. We're now in May, and we already know that this year there has been another increase. And so we can pretty much very confidently say that when these figures are released again next year, there will be another increase in the number of women who are being killed by their partners in this country.
So what you're saying there is that it's May now. We already know that from January to April of this year, we have already seen an increase compared to last year of the number of women killed.
Yeah, compared to where we were last year, this year, we've already seen an increase. One thing that I think is important to note is that over the past 3 decades, when we look at the overall picture, there has been a decrease in the number of women killed by their partners, but in the last year, we have seen an increase. And like I said, it looks like there will be another increase this year. And what you pointed out, Zara, is exactly right. It shows that this is not going away. It is getting worse.
So the broad trend is down, but the last year is up.
Exactly.
And we can expect the same again. I mean, that paints a worrying picture for the government, who is tasked with trying to bring this down and trying to make that trend continue to go down. I think everyone has been trying to understand over the last week, how is the government actually trying to fix this problem? It is a huge issue. What is their plan?
So the government's key policy on this issue is called the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. And that is a 10-year plan. It was revealed by the government in 2022. So it is a plan that covers the years 2022 to 2032. So we're right in the middle of it at the moment. And it's actually the second plan of its kind, following one that was launched in 2010 by the former Prime Minister. The first female Prime Minister this country had, Julia Gillard.
What happened to that plan? Why did it end?
So I'm sure it is a shock to no one that plan failed in its goal, which was to have a significant and sustained reduction in violence against women and their children. It did, however, lead to new services. For example, the 1-800-RESPECT helpline, which I mentioned at the start.
Which I think we've said it most days on this podcast over the last week.
Yeah, that was actually a direct result of that plan. And it also led to the creation of Our Watch, which I'm sure many people would be familiar with. But like I said, overall, we did not see a reduction in the prevalence of violence against women.
So the plan failed. A review found that it wasn't holistic enough in terms of who it included in the response. And so the government has come up with a new plan. What is that plan that was announced in 2022?
So for one, when the government released this new plan, it said that for the first time, this new plan included the importance of engaging men and boys. So that goes to them taking more of a preventative approach with the second plan and spending more resources on educating men and society more broadly on the issue. And so this plan has 4 key areas. They are prevention. Like I said, that was a really key new one for them to focus on. And then there's early intervention, response, and then the final area is recovery and healing. And I want to look at one specific section of the plan. One of the key targets is a 25% reduction per year in female victims of intimate partner homicide. So just to say that in other words, the goal is to reduce the number of women being killed by their partners by 25% per year. Now, when this was announced, Social Services Minister Amanda Rishworth was actually asked if this goal was too ambitious. And she replied that the targets are ambitious, but we need to start aiming for something. And I think that this target is super relevant at the moment because, as we talked about before, we've just learned that last year the number of women being killed by their partners has increased by nearly 30%. So that's in direct contrast to the government trying to reduce it by 25%. Now, it is important to just say that the goal of the 25% reduction starts from this year, and the report from the Australian Institute of Criminology said that the new numbers that came out this week will be the benchmark for what we measure the progress against.
Billy, thank you so much for that explainer, and thanks to everyone for listening. If this podcast has raised any concerns for you, you can always reach out to 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732. Take care of yourself, and we'll be back again tomorrow.